Welcome to the Road Home Podcast with Ethan Nichtern. Join Ethan as he and his guests explore the Buddhist path as it relates to art, culture, activism, politics, Western psychology, and more. If you'd like to support Ethan's podcast, please visit BeHereNowNetwork.com/Ethan.
Okay. Welcome back, everyone, or welcome to the Road Home Podcast. This is Ethan Nichtern, and I'm really actually happy to be here with someone I consider a friend, although perhaps not a close friend, but somebody I really respect and admire quite a lot, Jerry Colonna, who's the author of the relatively new book, Reboot, Leadership and the Art of Growing Up, which I'm just starting to play with that art form at the age of 41. So
you and me both.
Jerry, thanks so much for being on the podcast. I know this is a busy time for you.
Oh, thanks for having me, Ethan. And I'll give you the phrasing. I think of us as infrequent but close friends.
That's very sweet. That's very sweet. So usually my first question, because it's kind of lame and regurgitates itself, when I have somebody on the podcast, which is most of my guests are people who are either interested in or practitioners of or teachers of, and in your case, I think all three, some form of mindfulness or meditation. I usually ask how they got into that. And I just want to say, I am going to ask you that question, but I also, one of the things that struck me about Reboot is it really has a very strong memoir component to it, and really well-written memoir component to it, I might say. So,
thank you.
So the story of how you got into meditation is in the book, but since that's the first question I ask, I'm wondering if you want to share any piece of your process for how you got into the mind and mindfulness and Buddhism, or any else of it that you want to talk about.
Well, sure. Well, and first of all, thank you. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to think about these things and reflect upon them. The first thing that occurs to me is that the way I got into, quote, mindfulness, or the way I like to think about it, is the way I got my ass onto a cushion was because my heart was broken. And I think that that's true for a lot of folks. For me, I got here, if you will, because everything else failed. Like the bullshit failed, the delusion failed, the pretending failed, and I had nowhere else to turn. And when I found myself feeling just a tiny bit better, having sat, I finally realized that there was something to this whole meditation thing. And and then it was just a matter of following that trail of breadcrumbs into something that ultimately changed my life forever.
And so what do you, maybe a better question to ask is do you remember the first time you talk in the book about being a nightstand Buddhist for a while, meaning you had Buddhist books on your nightstand, but do you remember your sort of first deep meditation or experience, or the first time that practice kind of hit home for you?
That's a good question. I remember it as a slow arc, as a slow process. I remember some of my first meditation sessions and realizing that it was hard to just sit still for more than 30 seconds. I remember so a lot of those early memories will involve Ani Pema Chodron. And I remember one weekend retreat that I did with her. And I remember it was a summer, and it was in Colorado. And it was a big white tent, and there were probably 300 people in the room. And I remember feeling slightly nauseated and slightly faint from probably altitude and from sitting and probably dehydration. But I remember all of a sudden kind of just sitting and crying and not really being able to understand or hold on to any story associated with the crying. It was like I had tapped into a wellspring of feeling that existed beyond words. And I remember it was part of a several-day retreat. I don't remember how long, but I remember then not being able to sleep for 2 or 3 nights because it felt like I'd been wearing, like a sleep mask, and it had been taken off, and I could just see the world in a much brighter way. And I wasn't sure I wanted it at that point. I remember thinking, well, if this is what life is going to be like post-meditation, thanks, but no thanks. It's too much. So I that was probably summer of 2002, or maybe 2003.
All right. So that clearly, in terms of your work as a coach and your work as a teacher and a guide for others, I mean, that clearly has a really strong impact and influence on the way you approach these matters. And also, you talk a lot in the book about Ani Pema Chodron. As you said, you talk about your relationship with Sharon Salzberg. I would say the other big spiritual voice that I noted in your book is Parker Palmer. Along with a deep love for poetry that I didn't quite know that you had that. But I would say the book, to me, is there's basically 2 big conversations that are both, really crucial and not so easy conversations for people in mindfulness or Buddhist spaces or any spiritual space really to work with. One is the conversation on wealth, and the other is the conversation on leadership, which they obviously go together. But do you mind if we spend a little time on each of those in that order?
No, I'm fascinated. I mean, they're both realms in which I dance.
Yeah, I was really struck by your descriptions in the book, and this is what I thought was such a great piece of the memoir aspect of Reboot was how your notion of wealth was formed as a child. And you also talked about loving to play Monopoly, which I loved to play when I was a kid too. So that really resonated with me. But
anytime you want to play, Ethan, we'll play.
I think I would lose, but
I didn't want to go there, but there is that aspect of my personality that will come out.
This soft, gentle voice. So yeah, what was your childhood association with wealth, and why was that? I mean, obviously some of your approach to all of this has a real developmental psychology feel to it, in the sense of who we were as kids or who we were in our childhood influencing us. But how was your view of wealth formed?
So I'll respond first with a little bit of context. And that context is that I firmly believe that who we are as adults is far more influenced by the belief systems that we developed as children to survive and thrive within the family environments that we developed. Far more influential than we are conscious of. And so what you're speaking about is, and I noticed that you use the word wealth, and I tend to use the word money, which is a little bit different. One of the first things that I wanted to do with the book was to go at one of the core structures that influences our leadership choices, our work choices, our career choices. And that is actually our relationship with money. And I'll make the distinction between money and wealth because, well, both words have tremendous emotional baggage associated with them. They're actually different things. Money, in a very, very prosaic way, is simply a representation of labor and goods, and it's a means of exchange at its most fundamental system. And the value of currency is just something that you and I agree, that this piece of paper is worth X unit of time or something like that. And it's this like delusionary construct that we all walk around with. But because it's far more than that, it starts to drive us towards this notion of wealth, which I think is related to this notion of security. And what I do in the book is I talk about my own experience of money and relationship to money as a means for seeking safety. And I visualized it by thinking about my relationship to lemon drops, the candies. And I tell the story that when I was a boy growing up where we had a lot of financial insecurity and a sense of food insecurity, even that there wasn't going to even be enough food to eat, I never quite felt safe. And there were a whole bunch of factors associated with that, some of which have to do with the violence that I grew up with and the lack of stability mentally that was going on in the household. But very early on, I started to attach to my grandparents, my mother's parents, and form a sense of safety with them by spending time with them. And the thing about Grandpa Guido was that he always seemed to have enough money. And one of the ways I came to understand that was that in his pantry was what seemed to be a never-ending supply of lemon drops. And so very early on, I associated lemon drops with safety and money with lemon drops. And so money became a means to safety and security for me.
So lemon drops were your currency.
Lemon drops were my currency. That's right. That's right. And what I was really seeking was to feel safe. And then later in my life, I came to understand that the pursuit of money that had driven me was best understood as a pursuit for safety or a pursuit for lemon drops. And once I understood that that's what was going on, I felt free of the fear that I would not have enough because I had the means to actually see that relationship.
So, and also another theme related to safety, or the quest for safety, is this relationship to worthiness or unworthiness. So can you unpack that a little bit? Because in some ways it seems like these, to me, it struck me as sort of two different extreme beliefs of, I don't deserve money or I need it to feel safe. Like how you can bounce back and forth between those, or
yeah. So, or perhaps I don't deserve safety because I'm not worthy of it. Yeah. So that just hit you. So, by way of context, what I would say is I actually ascribe to a belief system that, put simplistically, we're all motivated by the pursuits of love, safety, and belonging. And by love, I mean the ability to love and to be loved. By safety, I mean physical safety, existential safety, spiritual safety, and belonging as a sense of, oh, this is the tribe. This is to whom I can attach. This is, these are my people. And when those three, in some combination, are threatened, our worthiness, our sense of our inherent goodness is challenged. Earlier you asked me about my first relationship to mindfulness. In some ways, the first sutra that I really internalized that changed the entire structure of my life was the notion that I was fundamentally, basically good. And that the problem was just simply that I had lost touch with that basic goodness, not that I was fundamentally unworthy. And that was like, what? Are you kidding me? That's not what I grew up with, right? What I grew up with was you were born in sin,
Mm-hmm.
and you have to overcome that sinfulness to be worthy of love. And if I learned nothing else about Buddhism but that precept, God, that's liberation.
Yeah. And is there also in this notion of a kind of a need to prove that you can be safe? I mean, how does that come into the quest for money? The like, how safe does a person need to be until they're safe enough?
Well, you hit upon the one of the core questions. I mean, I tell the story of struggling with this question of worthiness and safety, and going into my psychoanalyst's office and laying on the couch, um, and her name was Dr. Sayers, and her asking me, in effect, how much is enough? What will it take? How much money do you need to feel safe? And when I responded, stuttering out Bill Gates, I shocked myself, because that was a crazy objective. It was an impossible objective, but it was an honest goal.
Mm.
It was an honest answer. And when I heard that answer come from the depths of my childlike soul, I said, oh God, I need some work. I need some help, because I don't want to live my life in pursuit of something that's just not going to happen. Right. And so, I had to confront the fact that there was a kind of bottomless pit of lack of safety that I was carrying forth into adulthood. And I was trying to, as fast as I could fill up that pit, it would just be empty all over again. And so I had to go about it in a different way.
Is there, so this is such to go a little more into the unworthiness side of things, because I had my father on the podcast, who just wrote a book called Creativity, Spirituality, and Making a Buck, which is about the sort of livelihood component of being a spiritual practitioner from a kind of creative or entrepreneurial standpoint. So I do think there's a fair amount of dovetailing of the conversations, even though he's, from his own experiences, talking about making a living as a Buddhist and as a musician, so it's a bit of a different conversation. But this notion that comes in when people want to have a spiritual side or an ethical side, that there's not a fear of not having, but a fear of having money. I mean, like if I had a nickel for every time somebody sort of looked at me weird when they find out I make a middle-class living as a Buddhist teacher, it's quite often somebody who makes more money than I do, by the way, which is always interesting. But like, so I wonder, like, what is the fear of having about? And I mean, you mostly work with people who are already fairly successful in business. So I don't know if do you ever sit with a group of starving artists and say,
sure,
yeah,
sure.
what do you say to or a group of Buddhists who don't know how to get there? I know you've done that.
Well,
I know you've done that.
I have done that. Not having read your father's book, but I may go out on a limb and comment on what I think he may be trying to speak to, which is the very complicated relationship that we all have with money. And in this case, what you're talking about, when people are looking askance at you, it's because you're not fitting their projection of what your relationship to money should be, right? And they're actually not seeing you as a three-dimensional human who actually has a child who needs food. And someday not so much longer, but even diapers. And you have to pay for those things. And I think that's a rich area to explore. And so on the one hand, there's the people who are projecting onto you that you perhaps should not be charging money as a teacher. And then on the other side, there are a bunch of, as you described them, starving artists, but they could be starving spiritual teachers, or they could be, as I've had many times, starving entrepreneurs who ensure their own failure by sabotaging efforts to create meaningful revenue for their companies. Okay, that's a whole class of people. And again, what we're talking about, people who are wrapped up in a kind of strange detachment to this concept called money, this currency. And you know as well as anyone, perhaps better than most, that attachment and detachment are kind of two sides of the same coin, no pun intended. And that the healthy relationship is non-attached, right? Or to quote the Christian Bible for a moment, St. Paul did not write in his famous letter to the Corinthians, one of his famous letters to the Corinthians, money is the root of all evil. What he wrote is that love of money is the root of all evil. What he wrote was attachment to the gaining of wealth is the root of all evil. Right? Money itself should be merely one of the tools that we use to navigate life. Problem is that, like so many things, it's the stuff that we attach to it that end up creating the problems for us, not the thing itself.
So are there ethical limits? If I could just share one, I wanted to get your comment on a conversation I had with a friend and student of mine who is a successful person who works in private equity. And what this person said was, I fully believe that you can be a completely ethical, compassionate, helpful person and get quite wealthy. But what he said, and this always stuck with me, was if you're a billionaire, it means you probably did something wrong, meaning unethical. And that always really stuck with me, because a billion is it's part of this discussion for me when we bring it into a more interdependent or, the society that we live in, is the degree of inequality that sometimes exists in this matter. It's like a billion is 1,000 times a million, that's a lot. And so how would a mindful person, are there any objective measures by which an individual would say enough is enough, or do we need a kind of overarching force, say a progressive tax system, to come in and say people can't really check their own lemon drop insecurity, so we have to come in and do it for them to a certain degree?
So there's a lot in that question, so I'm going to unpack it in different pieces. The simplistic answer is that, again, if money is a currency, money itself doesn't hold ethics. Humans hold ethics. If I accumulate wealth and use that accumulated wealth for the betterment of people around me, is that a good thing? Potentially. If I do it to assuage a sense of guilt and manipulate the system to make myself feel better, well, what's my intention? I mean, I go back to the Eightfold Path here and say there's a lot to understand from the Eightfold Path. Right intention, which requires understanding your intention with discernment, is critical. Is it possible for someone with no money to act immorally and unethically? Absolutely. Is it possible with someone with wealth to act morally? Absolutely. I don't want to live in a world where that's not possible. And so I think it's important not to forever detach these two things, but to understand what's really going on, to pull them apart so that you can then put them back together in a way that's free of our emotional projections. The second half of your question, which has to do with a collective agreement to a collective commitment to equality and fairness, and you're asking about that by suggesting, for example, as an expression of that, a progressive tax system. The answer from where I sit politically and emotionally is, of course. And yes, money would be one of the areas in which you would focus on equity. But money is not the only area to focus on equity, right? Housing is an area to focus on equity. Education, healthcare, food security, equal opportunities, regardless of social location identification. A root cause of those inequities is the inequity in capital distribution. No question about that. But it is not the only cause of climate injustice, for example. It is a primary cause, but it is not the only cause, right? Race and racism is a cause of climate injustice as well. And so, the outer expression that you touch upon is a really important area of dialogue, and it's related to, but I think in my view, different from that internal relationship that is going on. And from where I sit, and this is rooted in the work that I do, the focus on the outer without a simultaneous focus on the inner doesn't really create any change.
So maybe that's a good moment to transition, because I think the place that your work really seems to go deep is into the question of leadership and coaching leaders and training leaders. And I actually remember sort of coming to you, or not sort of, but coming to you in this capacity at a moment where I had started one nonprofit organization, the Interdependence Project, and which was a lot of work, and I didn't quite know what my kind of emotional investment in it was, and felt very sort of overwhelmed by that. And I was trying to stay in touch with the other nonprofit organization, which was sort of my family, my spiritual family organization, Shambhala, which I always struggled to find my place in, and at that point just felt, and sort of always felt, was just kind of a oddly structured organization and difficult to find your place in, and I remember coming to a time where I was like, I kind of just want to write. That's the thing that always actually moved me. And I remember you just really listening very, very deeply, and so when I listened to your podcast with Dan Harris around this book, and talked about how you have this effect on people who are looking for leadership. You really, I think the joke there was about making them cry, but you're able to really find for leaders a place of vulnerability to come from. It seems like, and that seems like what your work is all about. So what is it like to work with you? I mean, who do you take on as in a coaching capacity, and what are you trying to do with them, either in a group setting or an individual setting?
Yeah. I'm gonna hold off answering the what are you trying to do until I sort of describe what it is that that experience is like, what I think it's like. So here's what I think happens. And I think you touched upon it a little bit. And Dan certainly touched upon it. So somewhere along the way, and I happen to think it has to do with my childhood, I developed a capacity to sit still and listen deeply to people. And a funny thing happens when we sit still and listen to each other. We start to feel our own hearts. And when we feel our own hearts, one of the things that spontaneously arises is our sadness. Now, to be clear, our joy often arises as well. But as a society, we are better at handling people's joy than we are at handling people's sadness. We have socialized each other to look away from suffering.
Mm.
We often don't know what to do with someone's broken heart when it shows up. We often will immediately go to fix it. Shh, don't cry. Or we will begin to explain how it's wrong. Oh, you don't feel that way. No, don't feel that way. Or we begin to show counterexamples. Look at how wonderful the world is. Well, you know what? Right now, that's not what the person is feeling.
Hmm.
And when that happens to anyone, they begin oftentimes for the first time in a very long time to feel seen, heard, appreciated, loved, cared for. And when we look, so there's that experience. Then when we look at people who hold positional or role power, positional role power coming from, say, the hierarchical position that they might occupy, versus, say, status power that may come from, say, the meat bag that they occupy, right? I'm a white cisgendered male. I have status power regardless of the positions that I play in society, that others may not have, others who identify in different ways. When we start to work with people who have power, who are often in what we refer to as leadership positions, and then what often arises is that we're dealing with the manifestations of their inability to deal with suffering. So you mentioned my spiritual teacher, Parker Palmer. He likes to say that violence is what we do when we don't know what to do with suffering.
Hmm.
Now, take in the truth of that and imagine, if you will, that the person who doesn't know what to do with suffering is, quote unquote, a leader, someone who has power. And imagine that they've never actually experienced a way to deal with their own internal suffering. They are going to wreak havoc on everyone around them. Sometimes it's our country, sometimes it's our state, sometimes it's our company, sometimes it's our Buddhist organization. And so, what is it like to work with a good coach? What is it like to work with someone who is trying to work in this realm? Well, a good coach, a good teacher, a good guide is a first responder and leans into the suffering and doesn't say, well, you have power, so therefore you don't deserve to have your suffering alleviated. Because let's face it, that is often the response that we have. The problem then is, though, that person who has pain and is suffering flails around and hurts everybody around them. And so for me, the work that I do is an extension of my bodhisattva vow. I am going to be a first responder into suffering. Now, sometimes I will respond with a fierceness and I will say, that is bullshit. Stop that behavior. And sometimes I will respond with love and gentleness and say, tell me about what happened when you were 5 so that we can unwind this behavior. But I don't know any other way that we are going to change alter the damage that corporate structures do unless we are willing to go into the fire of the suffering of leaders and others who hold power.
Mm.
And by the way, you can tax the hell out of them and it's still not going to change things.
Right. Well, the taxing the hell out of them or taxing them reasonably might be a part of the outer solution, but it's not. It doesn't touch the inner work.
Yeah, I mean, be unrealistic, be unreasonable. It doesn't matter. You're still not going to change the capacity to hurt the world.
Mm.
Right? You should have reasonable progressive tax structures. No question about that. But don't expect that to change the internal structure.
Right.
That allows them to justify unreasonable behavior.
So, I mean, going into suffering, Jerry, it seems so much like it's about vulnerability, and that completely seems to be what your work is about, is bringing out people's vulnerability. And I remember going.
Well, I would argue, Ethan, that it's about bringing out people's authentic nature. It's about bringing out people's reality. Now, that may feel vulnerable, right? But let's pick at that word vulnerable. What does it mean? It means I am susceptible to being hurt. Okay. Well, guess what? Behind the armor that you are wearing of invincibility and invulnerability, you're hurting anyway. So let's just drop the bullshit. Let's just drop the armor. And let's just show up. Can I give you an example that just happened to me 2 days ago?
Please.
Okay, so without naming the company, CEO of a very successful company, very large company, read my book, asked me to come speak to 100 of their top employees. So I flew to this location and I did a talk that is based on the book. And at the very end, there was this like dreaded silence, and I was like, "Oh my God, I broke them," But slowly they started opening up, and then the CEO, the one who held the most power in the room, opened up the book and started to read a passage around the pursuit of love, safety, and belonging as a means to a sense of worthiness. And he asked me to comment on it. And of course, being a coach, I used the old therapist trick and I turned it into a question to him. And I said, well, tell me what love, safety, and belonging mean to you. And he looks down and he goes, oh, fuck, I knew I shouldn't have asked a question. So anyway, he starts talking about his own journey and how he had come in 4 years previously and the division was a mess and he worked hard to turn it around. And he knew that he had been driving people insane, relentless pressure, to the point where a few months ago, several of his top executives had come to him and said, okay, you got to take your foot off the gas pedal. We're dying here. But he didn't know how to do that. And so he read my book, and all of a sudden he realized that, he grew up in Kentucky and son of a single mom and scared of never having enough. Doesn't matter how much money he has, scared of not having enough. And what ended up happening was we ended up having this dialogue that involved the whole team. And he stood up there and he said, I'm sorry I've been driving you. I feel like it's been on my shoulders. And I realize I'm on my shoulders alone. And I realize I can't do this without you. And he started crying. And one by one, some of the most senior people stood up and said, you have to understand that we have your back. And then one of the senior executives said, could everybody stand who feels like they want to have his back? And the entire room stood. And they were all crying together.
Hmm.
And what they committed to was that going forward, that not only were they going to be committed to continuing to being an excellent place at producing what they produce, but that they would be a place of true development and growth for every individual. And it was a magical moment because the leader, the one who had power, said, I hurt. I don't know what to do. Can you help me?
I mean, that seems hugely powerful. It also seems like, a big discussion here is also a patriarchal leadership structures and how, I mean, the notion of patriarchy, which may be collapsing around us in various forms as we speak right now, that notion and just in the memoir aspect of your book, your relationship to the patriarch was and the matriarch was so strong and so prevalent in your way of relating to your own journey. So, but the idea of patriarchy, I think, doesn't include really the possibility of sensitivity or transparency. Because the notion of patriarchy is, daddy keeps you safe, you don't ask questions, and as long as he's strong and keeps you safe, you just do what he asks. And that does seem to be the way a lot of organizations are structured. So for the leader to say, I'm flawed, or I hurt, or I have no idea what I'm doing, it seems like that's so dangerous to the daddy model of things.
Well, thank God, right? So again, there's two structures that are conflated. There's patriarchy, and then there's the socialization of humans who identify first as boys and then later as men. And let's make a distinction between those two states and then link them. So to me, patriarchy is the word that describes the system by which those who identify as male are put and promulgate a dominance that becomes a social norm that embeds so much of what we are about. And let's just, for simplicity's sake, use that as a little bit of a construct. I know it's much more complicated than that, but we'll use that as a structure. So we're describing the system. And as you've picked up, I'm really interested not only in the systemic, but I'm also interested in the individual. And so at the individual level, let's look at the way we socialize, and regardless of our gender identity, the way we socialize our youngest children. And one of the things that we socialize young boys with is to not know what to do with their feelings. And then we wonder why, when they attain a certain age and have certain kinds of power because of patriarchy, there is a kind of rampant violent behavior. I'm going to tell you a story. A few weeks ago, I did a talk in Denver, and a woman came to one of the talks, and it turned out that she was the director of a VA center. And she came up to me and she said, would you mind coming to talk to the vets? And I said, I don't mind. I'd be happy to, but I don't know what I have to say to vets. I've never served. The closest I've come is that my father served in World War II. Anyway, so we came and I did a reading from the book. And to lay out the picture, there were about 30 people in the room. Maybe 10 were staff people. The rest were clients. And this was a satellite clinic focused on combat veterans with PTSD. And of the staff, I would say 60, 70% were women, combat veterans who identified as women. And of the clients, almost all of them identified as men. And of the clients, I would say the median age was about 70. Okay. So you start to see this sort of picture of what's going on. And at one point, I'm talking about my own journey to identify, have I been a good man? Because I identify male. And have I been a good man with my foibles and my flaws and my weaknesses and the days in which I have operated outside of the bounds of my value system, the mistakes that I have made, all that put together, am I a good man? So we're talking about this question. And at some point we talk about millennials, and I'm generous, and I'm like, give millennials a break, okay? We left to them a really shitty world. And they're allowed to do whatever the hell they want, as far as I'm concerned, because the fucking Amazon is burning. And we did that to them. That's our fault. That's on us. All right. So we're sitting there, we're talking about this. And then out of the blue, I said something like, and think about the way we socialize children. Think about that phrase, man up. Man up. And there's silence in the room. And off onto my left, there's a man stands up, and he's got white hair, and he's wearing a baseball cap that says Vietnam on it. And he shouts out, man up is bullshit. And I look at him and I said, man up is bullshit. And he says, no, man up is really bullshit. And then he says, I was a medic in Vietnam, and the only goddamn thing the Army gave me was morphine and man up to give to the young men who were dying in my arms. And he burst into tears. And he came to the front of the room and he collapsed into my arms. And I held him as he wept. He then left to pick up his granddaughter from school. And Julie, the woman who had invited me, turned to me and she said, he's been coming for 10 years and not once has he talked about his experience in Vietnam. Man up traps everyone. Man up hurts us all. And there's a myth that goes along with that patriarchal system, which is that those who hold positional power are supposed to be infallible and capable of withstanding every single slings and arrows of pain and suffering. And not only is that unfair to the individual, it is dangerous to our society. Because man up leads to war, it leads to violence, it leads to climate problems, it leads to injustice.
And it also leads to a kind of quest for spiritual perfection, right? Where you project that onto hope that's there in somebody else, that somebody else, usually a man, has achieved some kind of spiritual perfection that you're then supposed to emulate or something like that.
I can see that, and it never occurred to me, but I think you're absolutely right. What I hear you saying, it leads to a kind of projecting onto that power figure, a perfection that just is not there. It's not human.
So, I mean, I'm often reminded, and this was in my first book, because I think this notion of sensitivity, being transparent, and you strike me, if I may say, and always have, as somebody who kind of wields their own transparency and vulnerability as your strength, almost to the point I wouldn't perceive it this way, but if I could, I bet you've been criticized at some point in your life by people who weren't really paying attention to you, as your vulnerability almost seems shtick-like, maybe? Like if one was going to critique the authenticity of Jerry Colonna, it wouldn't be that he's too macho.
Well, it's probably been I grew up being labeled as oversensitive.
Mm-hmm.
And I even wince at that word, sensitive. But I haven't, not to my face have I been called shtick-like, but I could see it. I could see it for sure. And you know what, Ethan, my response to that is the same as my response to those who at this point would say I'm weak because I'm oversensitive. You know what my response is? Fuck you.
I love it.
I mean, honestly, I am too old and too tired to care.
Yeah.
You know, here's what I know is true. When I show up in the fullness of my mess, shit happens.
Yeah. But
that's all.
Where I was going with all that was not to criticize you, but to lead, you know, what I think you are is an example of a male identified person, a white male identified person, even a capitalist white, but you are not the version of a successful in capitalism white male that is sort of projected at like a Bernie Sanders rally, let's say. You don't fit the stereotype, but you've been incredibly successful wielding your vulnerability. And I just wonder, it seems like it's so rare that a leader just really steps out and says, here's me with all my flaws, take a look. And how do we get more people to take that approach of you know, being open and vulnerable as a success, as a method of success, not as a method of like, well, I can't succeed in this cutthroat world, so I'm just going to be vulnerable and accept my failure, but actually using that to be successful?
Well, first of all, thank you for identifying that. I'll take that in and I'll accept that. But I don't think of it as, oh, this is rare and it's something I have to cultivate. And I'll take a little bit. I'll poke at your question, which is, how do we? I think you used the phrase, how do we make more people, in effect? And what I would say is, I don't try to make more people be that way. Because if you try to make someone be something, you're only going to bring out the defenses.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is a bastardization of a Buddhist, of a teaching from the Buddha. But this is the way I've internalized it. I once read something which I interpreted as simply this. The Buddha said, don't take my word for it, try it. And if it works for you, great. And if it doesn't work for you, that's fine. And that's actually the attitude that I take. If someone comes to me and they say, as this fellow did who invited me down to his team, I want to spend he's 61. I want to spend the rest of my 60s becoming the best possible CEO and the best possible man I can be. And by the way, I'm hurting. Then I'm going to say, here are some things you can try. Try this. If it works for you, great. And if it doesn't work for you, that's fine. But I can from where I sit, I can say that the methodologies that we are currently using predominantly, and you described one of those as patriarchy, they're not working so well. In fact, they're kind of fucked up. And so maybe it's time to try something new. Like maybe it's time to give all humans, regardless of their identity, the space to be fragile, vulnerable, fallible, flawed, whether they're a religious teacher, whether they're a Fortune 100 CEO, whether they're a stock trader, whether they're a politician. I mean, who are we really afraid of? We should be afraid of the sociopaths. And there are a few of them in the world. No question about that. But they're far fewer than we like to think. And if those of us who are not sociopaths gather together, we could kind of constrain in a gentle but fierce way the sociopaths. And we could put them all together and we can say, here, you go sit and meditate. And we're going to take your power away from you. But because we're so busy picking apart each other, the sociopaths rise up. Come on.
Well, Jerry, I want to honor that I know you have a busy travel schedule coming up, and so this might be a good place to pause for now. Maybe next time we'll just talk about poetry.
That would be delightful.
And I actually, a big compliment. I actually didn't know how good of a writer you were, so I really want to recommend to people either who are interested in leadership or interested in growing up to get the book Reboot, which I think people can find out more info about at the website rebootbyjerry.com.
That's right.
And hope to have you back on the podcast sometime when schedules allow. But thanks so much for being here on the road home.
Oh, thank you for having me, Ethan, and all the best to you and the family.
Thank you. Okay, so until next time, this is Ethan Nichtern, and this has been The Road Home. Take care.